it comes to foreign policy.
I know he gets criticized for taking the troops out of Iraq, but it's a situation where they were not going to get the protection from the sovereign country of Iraq, so they weren't wanted there anymore. Could a president keep troops in a country they didn't want anymore?
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, as we have this interview, there's more than 5,000 American troops in that country without a formal parliamentary agreement. So we could have had the troops there before without that formal agreement. We have them there now. So that really is a red herring, that argument.
In Syria, what if you were king, what would you like to have seen done?
Well, early on, I would have liked to have seen the red line enforced when they use chemical weapons. I probably would have argued for using aircraft and cruise missiles to take out the Syrian Air Force. I would have liked to have seen more help of selective Sunni groups. As things deteriorated, I would have argued for taking more steps to protect civilians. I think an interesting question, though, it goes back to the first day of things, whether we should have actually supported regime change. And the president stood up and said Assad must go without a plan for making him go and without a plan for replacing him with something better. So I would have thought twice and probably pushed back against the whole idea that we should contribute to the destabilization of the country.
The book is called A World in Disarray. Richard Haass is our guest for a couple of minutes here. Let's talk about going forward. Donald Trump is certainly I don't think anybody can say that he spent years studying foreign diplomacy and the world at large, and then he says something like NATO is obsolete. With your foreign policy background, what do you think as you hear something like that?
I'm quite critical of that. NATO is one of the reasons that the last 70 years in Europe look a hell of a lot better than the previous 50 years when you had two world wars. So NATO's been a fantastic success. The European Union has contributed to stability and to prosperity. So I think we've really got to think twice before we disrupt. Donald Trump's going to inherit an inbox, the way I would describe it, is one of disarray. The world is unraveling in various places. The last thing in the world I would think he needs to do is add to it. Instead, I would try to stabilize Europe, keep Asia stable. Don't question the basics of the U.S.-China relationship. Look selectively, perhaps, to make things less bad in the Middle East. Look for ways to helping Americans better contend with the pressures of globalization. He
also said that when asked what does he think of Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin, and he says they're equal. We'll see what happens. There's no question that he clearly wants to re-engage in some type of relationship with Russia.
Look, the idea of re-engaging with Russia is fine. I don't think we should get up in the morning trying to humiliate Russia or isolate Russia. Russia counts. On the other hand, good relations are never an end in themselves. We want to see changed Russian behavior. We want to see Russia stopping its destabilization in Ukraine. We don't want to see them invading any other NATO countries. They committed all sorts of war crimes in Syria. So we've got to be realistic. We can't afford to have illusions about Mr. Putin or think that somehow we can trust him or he's going to constrain himself. We have to put the restraints there.
The book is called The World in Disarray. Richard Haass is our guest. He is president of the Nonpartisan Council on Foreign Relations. The book is called A World in Disarray. How is Brexit going to change Europe?
Well, Brexit, we just had the speech this morning from the British Prime Minister, but Brexit will go ahead. What it will do is weaken the European Union, which is one of the pillars of European stability. The whole idea was to make Europe a place where war wouldn't happen again. So I worry about pulling the thread on the proverbial sweater here. I also think it will raise questions about European economic prosperity. So I'm not a big fan of it. I understand why people voted for it, and I think it's something of a warning signal that if societies don't do what is necessary to deal with the pressures of global competition, you are going to have pushback. It's why in this country now it's very hard to find supporters of free trade. So I take Brexit as a warning, but it's as terms of policy, I think it's truly bad for the United Kingdom, and I think it's truly bad for Europe.
What do you make of, we've been taught that diplomacy, and choose your words carefully and slow and steady and nuanced, and then you have a man who just blows it up in 140 characters.
I somehow had an idea where you were going with that question. Look, but I think you make a serious point. Words matter, but also consistency matters. The United States is a country that lots of others rely on, whether it's the countries of Europe, but also, say, the Koreans, the Japanese. Lots of countries around the world defer to us. they base their security on us. They have got to be confident that we are going to be reliable, careful, predictable, and so forth. So again, I know Mr. Trump's preference at times is to be disruptive. It's to shake things up. But he has to understand that if we start shaking things up, others will come to the conclusion they can't trust us. And then one of two things happen. They take matters into their own hands, and we don't necessarily want to see a world in which others, for example, proliferate, nuclear weapons, decide they need them for themselves, or we don't want to see a world where others, because they feel they can't rely on us, appease or one way or another come under the sway of stronger neighbors, be it Russia or China. So I actually think there's a strong case for the United States to remain consistent, to remain sober, to remain reliable.
Let's talk about China for just a moment. The one China policy and the Taiwan phone call, which I guess was set up by Senator Dole. Where do we go with this, and how much now that China is starting to sort of rattle back? What are your thoughts as you watch this unfold?
I think it's unfortunate. The United States and China have been able to cooperate now for, 4 or 5 decades. And one of the reasons we've been able to do it selectively is because we found a way to finesse this question of Taiwan's status. It's been good for Taiwan. It's flourishing as a democracy. It's thriving as an economy. And again, it's allowed the United States and China to cooperate, for example, against North Korea. If we put the one China policy on the table, it will kill off any possibility that any Chinese leader could work with the United States. It will trigger a massive nationalist reaction. It could also trigger something of a trade war, which would be disastrous for both countries. But the biggest national security threat that Donald Trump may well face as commander-in-chief is a North Korea that can put nuclear weapons on missiles that can reach the United States. We need China's help to deal with that crisis. It's certainly the best way to deal with the North Korean challenge. So I don't see how picking a fight with China over Taiwan is in China's interest, Taiwan's interest, or ours.
Dr. Richard Haass, the book is called A World in Disarray. You're president of the Nonpartisan Council on Foreign Relations, and you served under George Herbert Walker Bush. Good luck with the book, Doctor, and thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
7:58, a big 550 KTRS. Let's check in with Tim Weiland.